The Kansas plains in 1868 stretched endlessly, an ocean of golden wheat and whispering wind. But one patch of land, 30 miles west of Emporia, would earn a name spoken only in uneasy tones: the Silent Prairie. It began with the Reed family, settlers who had carved their home from the wilderness. Samuel Reed was a former Union soldier, steady-handed and pragmatic. His wife Clara, devout and kind, often sang hymns while tending her garden. Their children, Thomas and little June, were well known to neighbors for the laughter that once carried over the rolling fields. But one spring morning, that laughter stopped. In 1868, Kansas stood as a frontier of both promise and peril, a vast, untamed expanse where the horizon seemed endless and the silence could swallow a man whole. It was here, amid the windswept plains and endless wheat fields, that a modest homestead known as the Reed Farm became the backdrop for one of the strangest mysteries in American frontier history. The land around it stretched in all directions, golden, rippling, and empty, broken only by the outline of a wooden fence and a lonely windmill creaking in the distance. The Reeds had come from Illinois 5 years earlier, driven by the dream that so many settlers shared: a fresh start and a piece of land to call their own. Samuel Reed was a man of measured strength, the kind who spoke little but worked hard. He had fought in the final years of the Civil War, and though the war had ended, something of its weight lingered in his eyes. His wife Clara was the soul of the homestead, graceful but sturdy, her hands always busy with bread, cloth, or child. Their son Thomas, barely 12, had learned to ride before he could read, and little June followed him everywhere, her laughter chasing the wind like a song. Life on the Kansas prairie was not kind, but it was theirs. Each morning began before dawn, with Samuel out tending the fields while Clara lit the stove, her hymn humming through the walls. By mid-afternoon, the air shimmered with heat, the scent of earth and wheat thick in the air. From a distance, the Reed farm looked like a picture of perseverance: neat rows of grain, a sturdy barn, a smoke curl from the chimney. But to the few neighbors scattered miles apart, there was something quietly unusual about the place. It was too quiet. The wind, which carried the sound of every creaking wagon and distant call, seemed to lose its breath when it passed over their land. Even the prairie dogs built their burrows a good stretch away, yet the Reeds paid it no mind. They were frontier folk, hardened to superstition, their focus fixed on survival. Samuel often said that the silence was a blessing, a sign of peace after years of war. But others thought differently. Elias Crow, a neighbor some 3 miles east, once remarked that the Reeds' land don't talk right, a strange turn of phrase, but one that made sense to those who knew the language of the plains. The prairie had its moods, and those who listened closely could hear its warnings: the subtle shift of wind before a storm, the uneasy stillness before locusts came. Around the Reed homestead, that stillness was constant, unnatural, and deep. As winter faded into spring, travelers passing along the old cattle route sometimes stopped near the property line. They spoke of the eerie calm, the absence of birds, and the way their horses grew restless when the windmill came into view. Still, the Reeds went about their work undisturbed, unaware or unwilling to believe that something in the land had begun to watch them back. The Reed family had always been regarded as a model of quiet resilience on the Kansas frontier. Samuel Reed, a man of deliberate strength, had built his homestead with his own hands, plank by plank, after the war. His wife, Clara, filled that house with warmth, a small miracle in a land that seemed determined to erase tenderness. Together with their children, 12-year-old Thomas and 8-year-old June, and 3 hired farmhands, Eli Mercer, Daniel Holt, and a young drifter known only as Red, the Reeds had managed to create a rhythm of life that, though harsh, felt steady and secure. Each day began with the creak of the barn door at dawn, the groan of the windmill, and the faint sound of Clara's hymns floating over the fields. By sundown, the golden prairie glowed under their oil lamps, and laughter sometimes escaped through the cracks in the walls, defying the isolation that pressed in from every direction. Neighbors saw the family only occasionally, during trips into town for supplies or Sunday service at the small wooden chapel near Cottonwood Creek. Clara always brought pies to share, her kindness well known, while Samuel traded grain and tools with quiet efficiency. Thomas was a favorite among the local children, bold, curious, with a slingshot in his pocket and a habit of asking too many questions about the stars. Little June, with her long braids and wide gray eyes, was shy but sweet, often seen clutching her mother's apron as if afraid of being left behind. Their 3 farmhands, hard men made soft by Clara's cooking, worked loyally beside Samuel, plowing, mending fences, and tending the animals. For miles around, the Reed place was a picture of self-sufficiency, a sign that hard work could carve a life even out of the merciless plains. But in early April of 1868, small oddities began to unsettle that routine. Eli Mercer told the blacksmith in town that the nights had grown too still, that the wind, which once sang through the wheat, had fallen silent, as though the land itself were holding its breath. Daniel swore he heard footsteps in the barn long after everyone had turned in, though each time he went to look, he found nothing but the swaying lantern and his own reflection in the dark. Red, the drifter, joked that the prairie spirits had come to collect what the war had left behind. Clara dismissed it all as nonsense, but her eyes betrayed unease. She began keeping the children closer, calling them in before sunset, her voice trembling when the horizon turned red. On the morning of April 13th, a peddler passing by noticed smoke curling faintly from the Reed chimney. He waved, but no one waved back. That was the last confirmed sighting of the family alive. By the next sunrise, the smoke had stopped, the fields were empty, and the door to the farmhouse swung open in the wind. When Elias Crow rode over later that morning, the only sounds he heard were the creak of the windmill and the distant rustle of wheat. No laughter, no footsteps, no voices, only the sound of a land gone completely, impossibly still. When Elias Crow rode up to the Reed homestead that pale April morning, he expected to find the family busy with their usual chores, but as his horse slowed near the gate, unease crept into his chest. The place felt wrong, still in a way that the prairie never was. The gate was unlatched, swaying slightly in the wind, yet no one came to greet him. The smoke that usually rose from the chimney had vanished, replaced by a faint smell of iron and something damp, like rain-soaked soil. The wheat fields that had shimmered golden just days before now bent under a strange, heavy silence. Even the crows that usually perched on the fence posts were gone. When Elias dismounted, the soft crunch of his boots on the path was the only sound that existed in that wide emptiness. He called out, first softly, then louder. "Samuel? Clara?" His voice carried, but there was no answer, only the faint creak of the windmill turning in the distance. He stepped onto the porch, noticing a small child's shoe lying beside the door, its leather muddy and worn, as if dropped in haste. The front door was ajar, the hinges whining as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold. The half-eaten supper still sat on the table. Bowls of stew, bread torn apart, spoons resting mid-use. A candle had burned down to a stub, wax hardened in rivulets along the table's edge. The family Bible lay open, its pages fluttering faintly, as though disturbed by something unseen. Elias moved cautiously from room to room, calling their names, but found nothing. No overturned chairs, no sign of a struggle. In the children's room, June's doll sat neatly on the bed, facing the window, its porcelain eyes staring out toward the fields. In the barn, the livestock were restless. The cow mooed nervously, tugging at its tether, and the horses snorted, stamping the dirt floor. The tools were left mid-use, a pitchfork leaning against the wall, a wheelbarrow half filled with hay, and Samuel's coat draped over the stable door. It looked as if everyone had simply stopped what they were doing and walked away, except there were no tracks to suggest where they had gone. The ground outside was soft from recent rain, yet there wasn't a single footprint, not even the marks of a wagon. When Sheriff Latham arrived later that afternoon with 2 deputies, the search began in earnest. They scoured the fields, the stream that ran beyond the property, even the nearby woods. The only discovery was a series of faint impressions in the earth behind the barn, large, circular shapes pressed deep into the soil, too precise to be animal tracks, and arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. One of the deputies claimed to hear a low humming when he stepped inside one of the circles, though no one else heard it. By nightfall, torches flickered across the prairie, their light dancing against the vast emptiness. The men searched until dawn, finding no trace of the family, the farmhands, or any living soul. It was as if the earth had opened quietly in the night and swallowed them whole, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their last meal and a silence so thick it felt alive. As the sheriff and his men continued their search, they uncovered details that defied any simple explanation. Behind the main house, in the field where the Reeds had recently planted spring wheat, the soil bore strange marks, circular depressions spaced evenly apart, almost as if something heavy had pressed down from above. Each ring was perfectly formed, its edges clean, the ground within hardened and slightly blackened. No one could determine what had caused them. The sheriff knelt to touch one, frowning as he felt a faint vibration beneath his hand, like the hum of distant machinery. But when he pressed his ear to the ground, there was only the sound of his own heartbeat. Around these strange impressions, the grass had died, turning brittle and gray, while the rest of the field remained untouched. It was as though some invisible force had carved its shape into the land and then vanished into thin air. The farmhouse itself offered more puzzles than answers. The cellar, once used for storing root vegetables, revealed a discovery that chilled even the most skeptical men. A second hatch, hidden beneath sacks of grain, led to a shallow pit lined with timber and stone. Carved into the earthen walls were markings unlike anything anyone recognized, loops and spirals intersecting like tangled vines, their edges blackened as if burned into the dirt by fire or lightning. Sheriff Latham brought in Reverend Cole, hoping he might identify the symbols. The Reverend stared at the walls for a long time, his face pale in the lantern light. "These are not Christian," he murmured, "nor any scripture I know." One of the deputies whispered that it looked like a burial chamber, though no remains were found. The cellar floor was damp, but the water smelled faintly metallic, and the walls seemed to pulse with a clammy coldness that made every man eager to climb back into the open air. Outside, the prairie seemed to have fallen into an unnatural silence. Even the wind refused to blow across the property, and when it did stir, it carried a sound so faint and haunting that some mistook it for voices. Men reported hearing a child laughing one moment, only for the sound to dissolve into nothing the next. On the second night of the search, the deputies lit lanterns and took turns keeping watch near the house. At some hour past midnight, one of them, Joseph Pike, claimed he saw movement by the well, a tall, thin figure standing motionless beside it. Thinking it might be Samuel Reed, he shouted and ran forward. When he reached the well, the figure was gone, but the bucket rope was swaying gently, as if freshly disturbed. By dawn, Pike himself had disappeared, his rifle still leaning against the porch rail where he'd left it. The following morning, when the sun rose over the prairie, its light fell flat and colorless across the fields. The searchers, shaken and weary, agreed to halt for the day. None of them spoke much, but all shared the same unspoken dread that what they were searching for wasn't missing in the ordinary sense. It had been taken, drawn into something vast and wordless, leaving behind only traces, rings in the earth, burned symbols beneath the floor, and a silence so deep it felt alive. The search for the missing Reed family extended far beyond the confines of their homestead, but with each passing day, the trail grew stranger, colder, and more unsettling. Sheriff Latham led a dozen men on horseback, determined to find any clue that could explain how 7 people had vanished without a trace. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, flat and windless beneath a pale sky. For miles they followed what faint impressions they could find, shallow boot marks that seemed to lead south, though they faded after just a few hundred yards. Then abruptly the signs reappeared, heavier, confused, as if the group had been running. But no one could agree on what came next. Some said the tracks multiplied briefly, almost as though joined by others. Others swore they ended in sudden disorder, overlapping and turning in on themselves, before vanishing entirely on a patch of hard, darkened ground. By the 4th day, the men rode into a stretch of prairie unlike any they had seen before. The soil had turned black and brittle, its surface cracked like old leather. The grass that had once grown thick and green lay flattened and scorched, stretching out in a wide circle nearly 60 yards across. No fire had been reported, and no lightning storm had passed through in weeks. Yet the ground looked as if it had been struck by something fierce and deliberate. The sheriff dismounted and bent low to touch the earth. It was warm, though the air was cold, and when he drew his hand back, his fingertips were covered in a fine gray ash. A deputy called out that his compass needle was spinning uselessly, and another noticed his horse trembling, refusing to take another step forward. They stood there for a long time, no one speaking, until one of the men, an old trapper named Harlan, muttered that the land was spoiled, He said it the way one might speak of meat gone rotten. When Latham asked what he meant, the trapper only pointed to the horizon and said, "It don't sound right here." And indeed it didn't. The prairie, usually alive with the rustle of wind through grass and the cry of distant hawks, was utterly still. The silence pressed against their ears like the inside of a tomb. The men searched the perimeter of the scorched patch, looking for any sign of what could have caused it. They found nothing but a few melted fragments of metal near the center, unidentifiable warped pieces that shimmered faintly under the sun. They collected them in a burlap sack, though one man, handling the fragments, later claimed they burned his skin without leaving a mark. No animal tracks crossed the boundary of the scorched earth. Even weeks later, when spring rains returned and wildflowers bloomed across Kansas, that barren circle remained lifeless, blackened, silent, untouched by time. Farmers passing near it began to whisper that the Reed family's trail had ended there, not in violence, not in flight, but in erasure, as if whatever had taken them had erased even the memory of their passage. As word of the disappearance spread beyond the neighboring farms, the story of the Reeds became something far larger than a local tragedy. It grew into a riddle that everyone wanted to solve, and yet no one truly could. Newspapers from Topeka to St. Louis picked up the tale, each adding their own speculation, their own flavor of fear. Some called it a mass abduction, others a family murder disguised by the vastness of the prairie, and a few even whispered of government testing, strange lights, or divine punishment. The frontier was a place where the supernatural and the scientific often blurred, and the Silent Prairie quickly became the line that divided believers from skeptics. Sheriff Latham, still haunted by what he had seen, the circles in the earth, the scorched field, the missing deputy, clung to rational explanations. He believed it was the work of men, perhaps a traveling gang or a feud gone horribly wrong. Yet every time he tried to make sense of the evidence, the pieces refused to fit. There were no signs of robbery, no tracks, no bodies. The family's valuables, silverware, and coins remained untouched in a chest beneath the bed. Their horses, saddled and ready, still stood in the barn. Even the family Bible was left open on the table as though someone had meant to return to it. Latham began to write nightly reports by lamplight, his handwriting shaking more with each passing day, his words less certain. "The silence persists," one entry read. "Even the wind avoids that place." Meanwhile, the townsfolk developed their own theories, each one darker than the last. Some believed the Reeds had stumbled into a land cursed long before the settlers came. Old stories resurfaced about a burial mound nearby, said to belong to a vanished tribe who had once called that stretch of prairie sacred. Others whispered that Samuel Reed had brought something back from the war, not a wound, but a shadow, a curse that had followed him home. Clara's hymn book, found days after the disappearance lying near the property line, only deepened the unease. It was open to Psalm 91, underlined in her trembling hand. "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night." And then came the letters. Months after the event, several residents received envelopes with no return address, each containing a single sheet of paper. Written in identical slanted handwriting were phrases that made no sense, coordinates, half-finished sentences, and repeated words like light, below, and taken. Latham suspected a cruel hoax, but the ink itself was peculiar, faintly metallic, almost reflective, like it had been written with something other than pen and ink. The letters were destroyed out of fear, though a few fragments were said to have been kept secretly by those too curious to burn them. By late summer, even the skeptics had stopped riding near the Reed property. Livestock refused to cross its borders, compasses misbehaved, and some travelers reported seeing a dim glow rising from the wheat at night, blue, cold, and soundless. Whether those accounts were born of imagination or truth, no one could say. But what everyone agreed on was this: whatever had taken the Reeds was not done by human hands, and the prairie, once full of life and promise, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to return. Over the years that followed, the story of the Silent Prairie became more than a mystery. It became a haunting that stretched across generations. Farmers who dared to settle near the old Reed property spoke of strange happenings, and each account added another layer to the legend. Tools went missing overnight, found later buried deep in the soil. Lanterns flickered with no wind, casting long trembling shadows that moved as though they had minds of their own. The most unnerving were the sounds. Faint hymns heard at dusk, a child's laugh drifting across the wheat, or the echo of a man's voice calling for someone who never answered. The locals said the land was cursed, that it had swallowed the family whole and kept their echoes trapped beneath the surface. By the turn of the century, what was left of the Reed homestead had nearly disappeared. The barn collapsed into the earth, the house reduced to timbers and dust. But the silence remained. Not the peaceful stillness of open country, but a kind of hollow quiet. Heavy, watching, almost aware. Travelers who crossed that part of Kansas claimed their horses refused to move once they reached the property line. Some said the ground vibrated faintly under their boots, as if something vast and buried stirred below. In 1892, a widow named Margaret Doyle, desperate for land and too poor to care for ghost stories, built a small cabin near the ruins. At first all seemed well. She plowed, planted, and prayed. But within weeks, she began recording strange entries in her diary. Entries that wouldn't surface until decades later. She wrote of waking at night to the sound of footsteps circling her cabin. Soft but deliberate, sometimes she heard a child humming an unfamiliar tune outside her window. When she looked, there was nothing, just the moonlight brushing the fields. One evening she found a small handprint in the dust near her door. Too small to belong to any adult, but perfectly formed. The next night she woke to a single knock on her door, 3 sharp raps, then silence. In the morning she found a child's shoe on the porch, its leather cracked but clean, as though freshly polished. Doyle packed what she could carry and left before sunrise. Her cabin stood empty for years until a fire, sparked by lightning, consumed what was left. No one rebuilt after that. By the 20th century, the legend of the Reed disappearance had taken firm root in Kansas folklore. Scholars and amateur investigators came with notebooks, cameras, and strange instruments, hoping to explain the impossible. Some blamed shifting sinkholes or carbon monoxide. Others suggested psychological contagion among isolated settlers. Yet none of their theories accounted for the silence, the way sound itself seemed to die on that land. Even today, travelers say that if you stand there at dusk, the wind will fall away, the air will grow thick, and from somewhere deep beneath the soil, a faint voice will whisper your name. No one stays long enough to hear what it says next. As the prairie wind fades and the last echoes of the reeds' voices vanish into the dark horizon, we're left to wonder, what really happened on that silent stretch of Kansas soil? Was it something human, or something far older, buried deep beneath the land we thought we understood? Stories like this remind us that history is not only written in books, it's whispered through forgotten fields, through the cracks in old foundations, through the silence that still hums when the world falls quiet. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of that silence, the unease of unanswered questions, then you belong here, among those who dare to look deeper. Subscribe and step with us into the darker corners of history, where truth and legend blur, and the past still reaches out to be heard. Tell us what you believe happened to the Reed family. Were they victims of man, nature, or something far beyond both? Share your thoughts in the comments, your theories, your chills, your doubts. Each voice helps uncover another fragment of the mystery, because the story doesn't end here. Every vanished name, every forgotten town, every shadow in the archives has something left to say. And in the next episode, we'll follow another trail, one marked not by footprints, but by echoes. Until then, listen closely to the silence. Sometimes that's where the truth begins to speak.